Hi there, my name is Joshua Yearsley, and today I'm going to present on Root, a usability postmortem. So Root is a board game. It was released in 2018, and it's a highly asymmetric strategy game. So in the core game, you can play on one of four sides. You can play the cats, the birds, the Within Alliance, which is a kind of ragtag band of mice and foxes, and other small woodland creatures who are rising up against tyranny. And then there's the Vagabond, which is this wily raccoon adventurer that traipses through the forest. And so I'm going to be talking about our experience doing usability and user experience work on Root. And in case you're not familiar with those terms, basically usability is making sure that people have an easy time learning the game, and then playing the game, using the game's components, and just generally making sure that they have a good experience from opening up the box to closing it up again. And so I'm going to go over some usability and user experience positives. But most of this talk is going to be about the failures, and specifically the lessons that we learned from those failures and what you can take away into your own work. And so I'm going to start out by talking about icon testing. And so, in most games, you have a lot of iconography, a lot of illustrations, just a lot of stuff that helps orient people in different parts of the game. And so when you have all of these icons, you want to make sure that the icons are doing their job, that they're recognizable, that people understand what they mean, and that they get the job done. And so this icon is an icon that used to be in Root, but is no longer. And the reason why we got rid of this icon was because when we did icon testing on it, when we brought this up to people, either by itself or in a group with our other icons, and we asked people what they thought it was, they would give back all sorts of weird answers like, oh, it's a teapot, or it's a ghost, or it's a monkey. And these are all, of course, perfectly valid perceptions. People can only see what they see, but it's not the perception that we had hoped for, because this is meant to be a mouse. And so because of the user testing that we did on this icon, we knew that we had to change it, because when you refer to, say, a mouse card or a mouse suit in the rules, people need to be able to look at the table and recognize that mouse icon as being a mouse. And so here are four suits. We have our foxes, our bunnies, our mice, and our birds. And here's the new mouse. So after we did that icon testing, we came up with a new concept for a mouse icon. And the problem with that, the first problem, is that Kyle Farron, our wonderful, wonderful artist, hated this idea. He said, I don't want to draw a Mickey Mouse mouse. And to the point where now this idea of the monkey mouse icon has become somewhat of a touchstone for places where Kyle thinks that something is a bad idea, basically. But, we put this new mouse icon in front of people, and, invariably people would say, oh, it's a mouse. People understood what this new icon was. So this is a good change, right? Well, this is a presentation mostly about failures. So no, this wasn't a good idea. And I'm going to talk about why. Or I should say, I'm not going to talk about why, I'm just going to show you why. And I think you're going to get it here pretty soon. So here's our bunny icon and our mouse icon next to each other. And we're just going to start making this smaller, a little bit smaller, keep going. And I think that you might be getting the idea. It's that the icon doesn't scale well. So at smaller scales, the rabbit and the mouse just start looking a lot like each other. So even though the new mouse icon was recognizable as a mouse compared to the old icon, it was doing its job there, it was not distinguishable from the bunny. And although there are lots of elements of this icon that could distinguish it, the most important element, in my opinion, are these whiskers right here. And the problem is that these whiskers also happen to be the smallest element of the icon. So even though it's fine if you just have a card in front of you, relatively close by, the whiskers just do not show up in other contexts, especially on our game board when the icon is scaled down and it has this darker background. Those whiskers just kind of get reduced into oblivion, and so there's almost nothing distinguishing it readily from that bunny icon unless you look really close at it. So this was a big mistake. Unfortunately, we can't really go back and change it because we need to support expansion products that use the same iconography. And so you can still visit our friend the monkey mouse who's on our logo, without the tail, of course. And so sorry about that, Kyle. It was kind of a rookie mistake. But we know better for next time. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is storytelling and feedback. And the reason I want to talk about this is because Root as a game, it's a war game, but it's fundamentally interested in telling stories about politics, how power moves around through society, and basically, how people operate within conflict. And so I'll tell you a little story about how we use a few mechanics to tell great stories. And then I'm going to tell a story about how we fail at that. So this is called a sympathy token. It's a piece of the Woodland Alliance, which is that ragtag band of creatures trying to, rise up against tyranny. And an interesting property of this piece is that whenever you remove it from the map, whenever you go in and you suppress that sympathy, you have to actually give a card from your hand to the Woodland Alliance player. And so you might walk into a fox clearing, take out the sympathy, and you might have this tax collector sitting in your hand. And the tax collector is like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this. And basically goes and defects to the Woodland Alliance. And so using this pretty simple combination of mechanics, we can tell a nicely detailed story about what's going on here. However, a place where this falls down is in another system called crafting. Basically, what you need to know about crafting is that it lets you get the text on the bottom of the card. So all of that stuff on the paper on the bottom, you can basically, if you fulfill certain conditions, you can get that stuff on the bottom. So basically the way that you get it is you just need a particular piece in a clearing of a suit that matches its requirement. So if you look to the left of that box, you'll see a little bunny icon. And basically what that's just saying is that as long as you have your crafting piece, like your workshop, in a clearing on the map of that suit, you can get what's at the bottom. So in this case, we have a bunny workshop, we have a bunny requirement, and we can just craft that travel gear. You can walk into your workshop and craft that travel gear. But the problem is that there are a lot of parts of the story, and only some of them actually interface with the components. When you craft this card, you end up discarding it, you end up getting this boot, but you don't actually do anything with that workshop. And what we saw all the time was people would just look at that workshop And then they would just say something like, but what do I do with it? And this is a circumstance where I think we're missing an opportunity to provide feedback throughout this entire crafting process. Because the idea of crafting, you're at the anvil, or at the spinning wheel or something, and you're doing something very physical, it sort of evokes this physical action, and you're not getting that feedback from the game itself. And so I think all of these questions that we got about what do I do have to do with feedback. And so what I mean about feedback, one example is if you flip over this workshop to show that you've used it, to demonstrate that this is actually part of that chain of actions that constitute crafting. We found that when we instructed people to track the workshops that they used by like turning the piece a little bit or somehow physically denoting it, people tended to understand the process much better. Unfortunately, by the time we went to print, we had kind of waffled back and forth on whether we wanted to include any feedback mechanisms on these components, because the downside is that including this on the flip side means a pretty serious reduction in design space. It means that you can't actually have these kinds of pieces with different backsides. The backsides can only be used for this particular purpose. And factions that we released later in expansions actually did make use of the backsides in other ways. So in one regard, it's good that we didn't include this flip side, because we wouldn't have been able to make those factions the way that we did. But this was a trade-off. I really do think that this sort of feedback is really important for learning. And so it's important to be conscious of what are all of the parts of this action chain that I'm trying to teach, and how am I demonstrating that actually physically manipulating pieces of the game. And this is a great example of affordances. And in case you don't know what affordances are, I'm just going to give you an example. So we have this trash can here. We have these 3 trash cans. This trash can in the middle has a smaller hole to put things in, this circular cutout. And basically what it's doing is it's very strongly suggesting that you should put things that fit in there into that trash can. So bottles and cans rather than, crumpled up paper bags and things like that. The reason it does that is it's just harder to put the wrong stuff in there. And so this is an example of a restrictive affordance where it's actually restricting you from doing the wrong thing. And this kind of affordance is used in board games. This is an example from the game Scythe, where the player boards actually use these cutouts. There are these double-layer player boards with cutouts that force you to put the correct components into the right places on the player board. And so it's using those physical restrictions to point you in the right direction. Now, for Root, we don't actually use those kinds of physical affordances for reasons that I won't get into in this talk. But what we do use are these things called affordance prompts. This is kind of a made-up phrase. There's probably a more technical word out there that I'm not aware of, but this is the term that I'll use. And so what I mean by affordance prompts are places where on the interface, at the point of use, manipulating a component, pulling off something is at that exact focal point where you're pulling the piece off. The interface instructs you to do something. So in this situation, we have these workshops on this track, and as you pull this one off, it's prompting you, hey, score 2 victory points. And this is generally a much more effective method for prompting than, say, writing beneath the workshop's track, hey, every time you remove a workshop from this track, score 2 points. And the reason for that is that generally when people are focusing on something, their focal range is actually very limited. When a person is focusing on a particular point, the angle the number of degrees at which they actually can focus on something is very, very limited. You almost lose sight of almost everything else around a very small focal point. And so if you really want to get something across, you need to put it at the point of use. But there is a problem here. And the problem is false prompts. So when you're pulling these workshops off the track, you're being prompted to score 2 victory points. And so that leads to the follow-up question of, okay, well, when I put the workshops back on the track, does that mean that I lose 2 points? And there's actually there's no intuitive signpost for why that wouldn't happen. And so a decent number of people, when they come and learn the game, actually do assume that you lose points when you put these pieces back on those tracks with the prompts to score. Even though we don't explicitly say that you lose points anywhere, and even though it would basically be impossible for you to ever win the game if it were true. But it's still on us to make sure that people aren't getting the wrong ideas from these prompts. So, a lot of people thought that you did actually lose points. And so in later printings, we made explicit reference to the fact that these prompts don't work in the other direction, because we did find upon release that a lot of people were thinking that they did work in both directions. So these prompts are very powerful, but they can also be pretty dangerous. So I'm going to give you a little bit more, another example of false prompts. This is a situation where we did actually figure out that these false prompts were happening before release, so that's good. So this faction is the Corvid Conspiracy. It's a faction that we released in the Underworld expansion a year and change ago. They're this band of bomb-throwing crows and ravens and things like that. And the point on their faction board that I want to point you to is this crafted items box in the top right corner. And so one thing that happened during development was kind of running low on space. And so, I did the thing that any developer under the gun does, which is just to squish things down so you can fit everything, thinking that it just wouldn't be a problem. But what we found in usability testing, the first day of usability testing, somebody came in and, they put some items in this crafted items box. And they looked at it and they noticed that it was like pretty much exactly the perfect size to fit 3 items. And they asked, so it only holds 3 items, right? This box is smaller than the others. So that must mean something, right? And, when something like this happens, this is kind of my expression that I try to suppress as much as possible, but it's my internal expression at least. Because, this is completely unexpected. And it's actually the reason why usability testing is so important, is because developers make changes all the time. And there are very subtle implications of things that players are very apt to pick up on in cases where developers aren't. And you can miss these, these wacky things. And this, persisted on the next day. One person having a problem can sometimes be a fluke, but multiple people having the same problem becomes a pattern. And so the next day, sure enough, people came in and everyone was asking, so it only holds 3, right? The box is smaller. And so I want to really drive home this point that subtle differences create the question, well, it's different. How is it different? What are the implications of it being different? There's almost no innocent difference out there. And so you have to watch out for these. So this is another false prompt the crafted items box is indeed smaller, and it is indeed sized for these items in such a way. And even though we didn't say anywhere that there was an item restriction, the physicality of this part of the interface suggested it. And so you really need to watch out for this. And so all of this has a lot to do with thinking about context. And so I want to talk a little bit more about context. So this is a famous optical illusion. It's the duck-rabbit illusion. So, you know, depending upon where you're at, you might see a duck, you might see a rabbit. And this is an example of what's called concept unsteadiness. You know, basically where the same thing can have multiple meanings depending upon your perception. And so an optical illusion is one example of concept unsteadiness, but this applies broadly throughout many different fields. You know, it can apply to just concepts, to just ideas. It doesn't require a specific, you know, sense. And a very fun thing about this optical illusion that I only learned about a few years ago was just how context dependent this illusion was. So context matters in this illusion, to the point where researchers compared how often people thought this was a rabbit versus a duck at different times of year. And what they found was near Easter, people thought it was a rabbit more than at other times of year. Now, the effect is not extremely strong. It wasn't like 100% of people were saying that this was a rabbit, but there was a small noticeable effect. And so it being near Easter is just a piece of context that was informing the way that people were seeing this image. Rabbits were on the mind, so people were a little bit more likely to see a rabbit. And so I would like to talk about how context applies to reading our player boards. So here I'm showing a very early version of the player board for one of our factions. And I'd like to point out a specific part of the player board, which is the scoring victory points pane. So the idea behind this in development was that we wanted to basically give a reminder to people. If they ever forgot, like, oh, how do I score victory points as this faction? We wanted a little reference to be available to them in a convenient place. But one thing that we noticed during usability testing was that people would look at this and wonder, well, is this a reminder or is it a prompt? And what I mean by is it a prompt is, does this victory point gain stack with other places where it's telling me to score victory points? So if I have a card that says, okay, I craft an item and I get a victory point, do I also apply this victory point from this pane? So do I score 2 victory points? Do I score 1 victory point? And so very problematically, a lot of people actually thought that this was a prompt. And this sometimes pretty wildly changed the number of victory points that people were scoring, which is very dangerous. It means that people are really not playing the game as intended. So this was a dangerous misconception that people thought that this stacked with other places where we were prompting people to score victory points. And there's a pretty simple explanation for why people thought that this was a prompt rather than a reminder. And that's because everything else on the board was a prompt. You know, there was basically no other information that served the purpose that this reminder did. And so people took all of that context and they very rightly applied it to this part of the board as well. And so what we did was we got rid of that information on the player board and we put it on a card. We put it on a card called an overview card. And, you know, these cards just basically contain a short overview of that faction. And so we didn't change anything about the fact that we were presenting this information, but we put it in a completely different context. And all of this context screams, this is a reminder. There's nothing here that should be interpreted as stacking with other stuff. This is just giving you a broad overview of this faction. You're getting this card, other people are getting this card. Everything about it is screaming, this is a reminder. And once we did this, nobody thought that it stacked anymore. So this is an example of a place where context really, really matters in people interpreting your information. It is not enough to use the right words. You have to also put those words in the right context for them to be useful. And so the next part of this context discussion I'd like to talk about, I'd like to focus on the broader context of product design, bringing together audiences, and things of that nature. So we designed Root to bring in audiences from different parts of the board gaming landscape. We wanted a game that would appeal to people who are very experienced in war games and direct conflict games. And we wanted to bring in wider audiences who were curious about the genre or just didn't really know much of anything at all and were attracted to these cute woodland creatures. And so whenever you're bringing together many different audiences, you need to make sure that you include materials that are appropriate for them. And so we did this. We basically included 3 things in our first printing. We included the Law of Root, which is a rules reference document. The Learning to Play Guide, which is a smaller, more friendly, example-laden rulebook. And then we have a 2-turn walkthrough sheet, which basically lets people jump into the game without reading too many of the rules. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is the Law of Root, this rules reference document. And the reason for that is because it's very polarizing, or at least was very polarizing upon release. And the reason for this was it is, as I mentioned, written in the style of wargaming rulebooks. It is a very literal rulebook. It has very few pictures, and it is very highly structured in a way that is not the same as many traditional board game rulebooks. And the Law of Root actually caused quite a few flame wars and really angry discussions on Board Game Geek, a popular board game discussion site, to the point where I had to shut down some of these conversations because they were just getting too heated. Because basically what happened was people kind of sorted themselves into 2 camps. We have one camp that thought that this rulebook was great, that it read well, that the rules were clear. And then you had another group that thought the opposite, that just really, really did not like it. And I want to point specifically to the top comment here, which says, there are a number of problems with the Law of Root, not least of which is the need to read it completely literally. So I think that this really gets at the crux of the problem, which is we have these different audiences coming in, and one of them basically understands this tradition of rulebook writing and that is very literal, and one of them is not familiar with it. And that is absolutely not a problem with that audience. It is a problem with how the rulebook is written and how we present it to that audience. To the middle statement here, also gets at the crux of it. This is a conflict simulation or war game rulebook, not a board game one. That's the problem. Not to judge, I think I understand. So that's kind of the core of a lot of the critiques of this rulebook, is that it is not written in a style that is useful for much of the audience. And so these flame wars, these heated discussions came from 2 audiences coming together from different perspectives and not really being able to get out of their own fishbowl. There's a famous David Foster Wallace speech about two fish swimming along, and a third fish swims by and says, "Hey, how's it going? How's the water today?" And then the first two fish say, "What water?" So, this is an example of two very different groups of people coming from different traditions. And so one way that I like to think about this is in the framework of decoupling norms and contextualizing norms. I referenced these critiques that talked about literalness before, and how some audiences are very used to pure literalness and some aren't. And so these decoupling norms are kind of reading the letter of the law as the letter of the law without bringing in too many outside experiences. Whereas another group is bringing in contextualizing norms. They're taking in ideas from other board games they've played, and they're applying it to this game. And as I said before, neither of these styles of reading are wrong. But what we failed to do is to properly introduce people who are more familiar with contextualizing norms to the very literal way that the rules reference is written in. Because wargame rulebooks are written in a very particular style that we duplicated. This is an example of one from a game called Cuba Libre, which is a very popular modern war game. And you can see it's very dry, almost car manual-like. Few pictures, itemized, numbered rules. The only picture on this page actually is just this joke about airstrikes and reprisals in brutal warfare. So, this is the kind of tradition that we're working in terms of how dry the rulebook is. And so what we do in later printings is we write it up front. We talk about how to read this document. We don't leave it to chance by just hoping that people understand the traditions of a document like this. And we actually tell people, for example, to follow the literal word. It's important to enculturate people into how the document is written. And so this was a failure of ours that we hope to solve in later printings. And so when you bring in different audiences and you draw from different traditions, you need to make sure that you are telling people that you're doing that. So that's an important aspect of making games that bring in different audiences. The other thing that I would like to touch on is the walkthrough. So we included this this double-sided walkthrough sheet in the first printing of the game, which basically just it walked you through your turns. It said, okay, do this, do this, do this. And it basically just showed you how your faction worked. And similar to the Law of Root, a lot of people really liked this, but there was another group of people who just really did not like it. And again, we fell prey to the context problem. Because almost universally, the people who said that they didn't like it said, okay, I get what I'm doing, but I don't understand why I'm doing it. And so there's a large audience of people who really needed a lot more effort on our put into context for why you're doing things, strategic reasoning, how these things hook into other systems. And so in later printings, we actually expanded this walkthrough into a little chapbook called Walking Through Root. And so in this, we still do this step-by-step, walking through, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this. But in between a lot of these steps, we describe how all of these things hook together, why you're doing this, what implications it has. And so we give a lot more context into why people are doing this, and people just really love this. And so I really cannot stress enough how context in all of its forms is just really, really important in writing rules effectively. And one publisher that I think that does this really well in the video game space now is Paradox. the creators of Crusader Kings and Europa Universalis and games like this. I must admit that when I got into one of the earlier Crusader Kings games, I just felt way over my head, got really confused. But the latest release, Crusader Kings 3, was just so much better at doing this than the previous releases. And it's because they're doing this wonderful job of creating wikis, YouTube videos, how to plays, Discord chats. They're just really creating this thickly interwoven, context-heavy mesh of learning materials that I think Root does a better job of emulating now. And I think that we can, really, we can increase the intricateness of the games that we're creating and introducing to wider audiences by creating these thick, variable, context, rich learning materials. And so the last thing that I want to talk about a little bit is cognitive load. So Root is a pretty intricate game, and it requires a lot of thinking. The cognitive load to learn this game is pretty high. All of the factions work in pretty different ways. They share some common basic actions, but they're all remixed in tons of different ways. The factions score points in different ways. So learning your own faction and learning other factions can be somewhat taxing. And so we needed to figure out a way to onboard people in a way that reduced the cognitive load as much as possible. And so the first way that we tried this was using synchronous teaching. So I had talked before about these overview cards, which are these, basic descriptions of the factions in the game. And so the idea behind this teaching strategy was we would give these overview cards to their respective factions. We would give the cat card to the cat. And we would basically instruct people to, play around, just kind of get your bearings for a round. And then at the end of that first round, you should basically look at your overview card and you should kind of introduce yourself to the other players. You should say, hey, I'm the cats. Here's what I'm about. And then the bird player can say, okay, I'm learning what you're about. I don't like you. Here's how I can fight you, things like that. And that was the ideal, right? But we quickly found out that this teaching strategy was just not going to work. Because we went out to some bars, and I would highly recommend, if you ever do usability work, to test your games in bars. And the reason for that is it's often a pretty bad atmosphere to hear each other in, to see each other in, and just generally to learn games in. It's almost like a stress test for your game. And so we would go to the bar and try teaching using this style. And the first problem, as you might imagine, is that it's hard for some people to hear this important information. Not everyone is ready to be the teacher in this circumstance, and they might not speak loud enough. They might not be prepared for it. And so, they might not talk loud enough or with enough projection, or they might be confused and stumbling over the words that are on the card. And so it just makes it difficult to learn when you're kind of put on the spot like that. But the other problem, and probably the more important problem, is that a lot of the times players just weren't ready to learn. You could have somebody who's introducing their faction the best that they can, but everyone else at the table might just still be busy internalizing their own faction. I mentioned that Root is a very asymmetric game. All of the factions work in different ways. And so if somebody's not ready, they're just going to gloss over it. It's not actually going to do any good if somebody is describing their faction because they are not prepared. And so between these problems, you're losing out on most of the teaching. It's practically useless, to be honest. And so for Root, the strategy that we settled on was an asynchronous teaching strategy, where instead of one player getting their card for their own faction and teaching other people, we basically decided to give the faction cards to everyone. So on their own time, whenever they feel comfortable with learning about other factions in more depth, they can reference this card. So this accounts for the fact that people are learning at different rates and are learning in different ways and will be ready to learn about the other factions on different schedules. So an asynchronous teaching strategy is much more it's much more able to teach people in different circumstances. It's much more reliable and resilient to situations that aren't ideal for teaching, and just to people who learn differently. And that's pretty much where I'm going to end it. I hope that this has given you a little bit of look into usability and user experience in board games. And I'm excited to answer your questions. So thanks so much.